Witajcie drodzy widzowie. Dzisiaj mam do zaprezentowania wam wywiad z amerykańskim komunistą. Towarzysz Jay prowadzi podcast Politics in Command, jest częścią zespołu pracującego nad kanałem Marxism Today oraz był częścią wielu organizacji lewicowych. Rozmowa będzie dotyczyła głównie tematów amerykańskich. Porozmawiamy o wyborach, o historii komunizmu w USA, o koncepcji amerykańskiego narodu oraz o tym, czy imperium Amerykanów upada i czy rewolucja socjalistyczna w USA jest możliwa. Oraz o tym, czym jest Maoizm. Rozmowa odbyła się w języku angielskim. Dostępne są polskie i angielskie napisy. Dla wprowadzenia zapraszam do wysłuchania krótkiego fragmentu amerykańskiej socjalistycznej piosenki. Zapraszam.
Conditions they are bad, and some of you are sad. You cannot see your enemy, the class that lives in luxury. You working men are poor, will be forevermore. As long as you permit the few to guide your destiny, shall we still be slaves and work for wages? It is outrageous, has been for ages. This earth by right belongs to toilers and not to spoilers of liberty. Working men unite, we must put up a fight to make us free from slavery and capitalistic tyranny. This fight is not in vain. We've got a world to gain. Will you be a fool, a capitalist tool, and serve your enemy? Shall we still be slaves and work for wages? It is outrageous, has been for ages. This earth by right belongs to toilers and not to spoilers of liberty.
Hello dear viewers. Today we again have a very special event because I have invited another guest on my channel. Today I have a guest joining me straight from the belly of the beast, the great Satan, the United States of America. My friend here, his name is Jay, and he is a host of the podcast Politics in Command and also part of the team responsible for the Marxism Today channel. Hi Jay, if you want to introduce yourself and tell me anything more you want to say about yourself, please do.
Hello everyone, I am Jay, the host of Politics in Command podcast. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invite. It's exciting to get an international interview and recording and to connect with your audience over there. I hope the movement is growing, and I'm always excited to hear, learn, and connect with other organizers and even content producers in other countries. So really happy to be here. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I got into Marxism about 7 or 8 years ago. So I've been studying Marxism for about 7 or 8 years. And in that 7 or 8 years, I should back up. I've been organizing for about 15 years. But I didn't become a Marxist until 7 or 8 years ago. And that obviously changed the way that I approached organizing. And I've been in many different organizations. I've been across the country. I've traveled the world. Obviously a lot of study for the 7 to 8 years. And yeah, I started the podcast Politics in Command a few years ago. I've been very inconsistent with it, mainly due to my organizing efforts, just being very busy. But I think the podcast episodes that I do have, I've gotten really good feedback from, and people do really enjoy. So if you're interested in Marxism in general, but more specifically MLM or Maoism, this might be a good podcast for people to check out. I'm still producing episodes, just very inconsistently. And producing the episodes helps me develop politically, theoretically, understanding historical knowledge to be as accurate as possible. And, through all my experiences of organizing and studying theory and practice, I kind of try to put that into the podcast as much as possible. I also do some work with the YouTube channel Marxism Today and their team over there. And I've done a couple live streams in the past few months. So whatever I'm studying at the moment, I try to put out to the public for the audience, people who are interested in Marxism as much as possible. So that's kind of just a wide, broad introduction of myself, I think.
All right. Thank you. And I'm also very excited and very happy that you agreed to join this interview. And it's also, I think it's very, very important that we make this communist project as international as possible, because we need international collaboration between content creators and between organizers. I think it's very good to have.
Agreed.
And to everyone, I'm just gonna say very quickly, please check out the podcast Politics in Command, and please check out the Marxism Today channel. Which actually is a quick anecdote. When I was running my channel, I needed to put a few channels as recommended channels, to put people through the pipeline. Let's call it like that. So to have just a few recommended channels on my YouTube channel, and I put Marxism Today as the first one. Even before we met, I was like, yeah, this is probably the stuff that I want people to listen to. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you here, and appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Great, thank you.
Let's continue with the interview then. And let's start with the first question, which is going to be the question that I am going to ask all my guests as the first question. So basically, why are you a communist? So this is the most personal question, of course. So answer in as many details or as little details as you want, of course. I will not push you to say anything you don't want to say. But basically the point is, for an Eastern European audience, it often feels very weird when they hear that someone in the general so-called West is a communist. They probably imagine some, idealist kid not knowing much about history, read some books by Marx and decided, oh yeah, this guy is great. He seems to know a lot of stuff. I like the Soviet aesthetics. I'm gonna become a Marxist now. But as we both probably know, behind every Marxist, behind every real committed communist, there is usually a long story of ideological development that is full of personal experiences. So I wonder how this path looked for you, and what kind of experiences can turn an American into a communist. Please.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll try to answer it as best as I can. So, I mean, I don't know. I want to reverse it a little bit and just say, why aren't more people communists? Why am I we should all be communists, because to be a Marxist, a communist, we want to understand the world around us as accurately as possible, and we use a lot of knowledge from different scientific branches to understand the world: biology, physics, chemistry, etc. But when it comes to our social systems, our economic systems, our political systems, our cultural systems, etc., there's also a science there to understand. And one of the most accurate sciences, and in some regards the only science to study certain aspects of society, is Marxism. But to get to that level, you have to go through, to even start asking those types of questions at that depth, we have to go through a large series of experiences through life here in the U.S., but maybe generally throughout the West, or more specifically, more industrialized imperialist nations. And we have to go through a set of experiences that start to spread a lot of doubt about everything we've been told about society. And I was, for many years of my life, I was a typical American kid that grew up with the American dream. This dream in America that you could be anything that you want as long as you work hard. You can become a millionaire, you can become rich and successful and build a lot of security and safety through hard work. There's tons of opportunity. It doesn't matter who you are, etc. And I very much grew up with that narrative. And I actually believed it for a very, very long time. But there was a series of events throughout my whole life that just caused more doubt and more doubt and more doubt. And even when I started organizing 15 years ago, I was not yet a Marxist. And I still, was learning about society, knew things were wrong with the world and the U.S. in general, and wanted to try to get active and become an activist and organizer and do something about it. But even more specifically, I was born in a military family, so I think the idea of the American dream and American nationalism and patriotism was probably a bit more stronger in my family and background, as probably most are in most military families here in the U.S. But yeah, it just growing up with things like 9/11, the 2008 recession, then having all these movements in the 2011 Occupy movement, to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, to Standing Rock in 2016, to the Me Too movement shortly after, then COVID. I mean, it's just a series of events that it should have a lot more people questioning society and leading them towards Marxism or communism. But there's a huge ideological state apparatus here in the U.S. And I would argue it seems maybe even more developed in industrialized nations. But so this American dream is one of those ideological obstacles that we have to overcome, along with so many different ideas, bourgeois ideas that are conditioned inside of us. And if we have enough, let's just be frank and blunt about this. If you have enough horrible experiences in life to break down those obstacles and bourgeois ideas, to really get you to start thinking a bit more independently and asking these larger questions, and then actively seeking out answers to those questions, it eventually lead you to somewhere on the left. But in the U.S. specifically, there's a strong ideological struggle from the bourgeoisie against communism. So anti-communism has been a very large part of U.S. history since the 20th century, and still ongoing. So even when people start to question society and having these series of events that are horrible to get them to question things, it's still another obstacle to get over the anti-communism. So we have a lot of petty bourgeois ideas that come in here and kind of tell people where to go, which is what I was when I was an activist organizer before Marxism. Was largely influenced by petty bourgeois ideas, where they were against a lot of these bourgeois ideas in societies, maybe against the wars overseas, whatnot. But then finding their own solutions, a petty bourgeois solution to these things. Again, the petty bourgeois here is this vacillating class that goes back and forth between siding with the working class and sometimes, and then siding with the bourgeoisie at others, and then kind of having their own ideas in some aspects and particular events that happen. But yeah, so that's I think for me, it was just a series of events that really got me to question things, and then having a very serious, disciplined approach to seeking out answers, and connecting with different types of people, and just overcoming the anti-communism and other ideological obstacles to really get us to answer these questions as objectively as possible. And that's a really difficult thing, especially when you're on your own. So it really helps when you find people to kind of guide you to Marxism, show you all this communist history, and to learn from it, to study it, to implement it, to be a principled communist. But there's so few principled communists in this country that it's going to be very difficult to find someone to help be your mentor or guide. And I understand that. But, I was also lucky that when I did start studying Marxism, socialism, communism, I did find a mentor early on that was a Maoist and began to show me, I'd have all these questions and they'd be like, all right, read this book. And I'd have questions about this and they'd be like, all right, read that book, and so on and so forth. And then I'd meet other people that also became mentors of mine. So relatively speaking, I was pretty lucky. But at the same time, it took me about 7 or 8 years of just organizing in general before I even really stumbled upon Marxism, let alone a good Marxist mentor.
Right. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's funny that one of your first mentors was as a Maoist. I imagine it helped you go really deep into Marxism really fast.
Yes,
but
it did.
And another thing I wanted to comment on was, you say that, being born in the US, you first need to wake up from the American dream. Like, that's the first priority, is to wake up from the American dream. The American dream, its ideological consequences are so vast that, like, for people, like, especially being born in the 80s, 90s in Eastern Europe, I think that's also the same thing. They still need to wake up from the American dream. I think maybe today it's a little bit easier for people to wake up from this. But yeah,
well,
just
you're right. There's a famous comedian named George Carlin that would talk about the American dream, and he would say, well, that's why they call it a dream, because you have to be asleep for it to happen.
Yeah, you have to be asleep for it to believe it.
Yep.
You have to be asleep for it to believe in it, and I think that's what happened in a lot of people's minds in the 90s. They were like, okay, now the oppressive communist system has fallen. Now we have all of these opportunities, and all these years go by, and it's there's some doors open, some doors closed, but we can see more and more adverse effects of capitalism piling up. So a lot of people are asking more and more questions. Well, one more question I have to what you have said is, I'm wondering, you said you were organizing before you found Marxism. So what kind of organizing was that? Was that politically sound with a clear ideological did it have a clear ideology? Was it just purely economical or some social issues?
Yeah, it wasn't so clear. Like in those spaces, the non-Marxist activist organizing spaces are generally afraid of the word ideology. So they think it's just bad and think that they don't have an ideology, but we all have one, at least. So when I first started getting into organizing, my mindset at the time was like, there's a lot of fucked up shit in the world. There's a lot of bad things happening. So how do we fix it? And then I discovered an organization that really talked about all of these technologies that can really solve the issues in the world: hunger, housing, anything, farming. And it was helpful to be in that organization, to kind of open my mind up to all this amazing technology that we do have that really can solve a lot of the issues in the world. It was, I don't know if anybody knows about it, but it was called the Zeitgeist Movement. And that was also connected to this thing called the Venus Project. So they just focus on, they're like anti-Marxists, and they focus on like just educating people about the technologies that we have. But then, after doing that for some time, I was like, well, why can't we implement these technologies? Then I found anarchism, and anarchism obviously says any type of authoritarianism. Hierarchy is the root of all of society's issues. And a lot of this hierarchy, authoritarianism, is embodied in the state. So the state must be smashed. So although it gave me more of a revolutionary mindset to smash the state, overthrow classes in general, there were still a lot of questions during that period that couldn't be answered by anarchism. I will say, during my anarchist days, I also got into the peace and anti-war movement here in the U.S. organized there for many years. I was able to travel the world with different organizations. It was a great experience, learned a lot. But again, predominantly petty bourgeois. As much as they would deny it, they're very much a lot anti-working class, anti-bourgeois, and kind of have their own morality, so to speak, that kind of guides what they think should be correct. And they're heavily influenced by different various churches and religions. A lot of church religious activists. Huh?
You mean the anarchists or the other organizers?
No, the peace and anti-war movement.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then, I don't know, the anarchists, I don't know, they're kind of, I mean, in hindsight, it's kind of a joke now because they're just so individual and very liberal, a different type of liberalism, but liberal nonetheless, and believing that it's about the freedom of the individual that should be the primary thing that will then, I don't know, somehow magically have freedom throughout society. So it's a lot of wacky thought, a lot of thinking and ideas that just don't make sense once you really critically think about them. And so there's a lot of, and I also, one of the biggest things that impacted me in anarchism was like, socialism is evil, Stalin is evil, whatever. And then I realized to myself, I was like, I really don't know much about the Soviet Union. I really don't know much about Stalin. Why are they so evil? Like, what is actually going on here? So then I really started to try to look into the history of socialism and communism back around 2017, like I said, 7-8 years ago. And just kind of blew my mind about some of the things that I was reading and started to seek out any type of communist organizer and ended up finding a mentor. And that's where I kind of just been studying Marxism since.
Right. So it seems a lot of what pushed you toward communism was just seeing the problems with the world around you, trying to find those answers, trying people who seem to have some answers, but then that was not satisfying for you, so you just kept pushing deeper and deeper until you found Marxism. Yeah,
there is another point that I was kind of vague on, but there was a series. I'm not going to go into details here, but there was a series of events in my life that were just not so good. I had, like I said, I grew up with the American dream. I became an adult, and shortly after, I came from a working class background, and I've been working class my whole life. So going from job to job, at a very young age, from McDonald's to a telemarketer to a roofer to a framer. This is all construction work. To laying tiles down on, floors in major corporation shopping centers and whatnot. And just realizing not having health benefits, health insurance, living paycheck to paycheck, getting paid under the table, which is a figure of speech here, meaning like you kind of just get paid in cash every week. So it's kind of not documented through the government to add on to your Social Security later on, things like that. And it was just like, after years of that, it was just like, this is not the dream that was told to me my whole life. And a lot of, just like bad things just kept happening over and over and over. So yeah, that plus everything you said has kind of just guided me to start looking into things. I think one of the biggest things here that was beneficial to me, and not everyone has this privilege, was I was kind of in a spot to have the luxury of time and energy and accessible resources like good internet to start asking questions, looking up, researching, reading, just, having all these questions and time to read, which I think people also forget that is a crucial. If you don't have time or energy to do any of this stuff, like, it's going to be very difficult, because Marxism there's a lot It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. It's it goes, I mean, it's also related to the question that so many people have, which is, for example, why are so many Marxists, like petty bourgeois, wealthy people, or like all these theoreticians like Engels, for example, like coming from upper background. But like, honestly, if you are someone working 12 hours a day in a factory, you're not gonna become a Marxist theoretician. You just don't have possibility of doing that. So it's very important to actually have the time and resources. Like now with the internet, it's so much easier for a person of working class background to actually research Marxism than it used to be. So yeah. Another, I wanted to say something, I'm not sure. Yeah, it must be a huge contrast, just being in America, believing in the American dream. Well, you're supposed to be, in Poland, they never told us, we are the richest country in the world. We are the best country in the world. We are the freest country in the world. Well, they told us, we're doing quite well, and we are not the best, but we are not the worst. But it must be a very crazy contrast when they keep telling you that you are the richest country in the world and the freest country in the world, and you don't get like health insurance and get paid under the table, like half legally or illegally. So I guess that must influence you somehow, even if it doesn't make you a Marxist. It must make you question some things around you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you very much for that. Let's took actually quite a lot of time, so let's quickly move on to the rest of the interview and start with the second question. So I invited you here to talk about specifically American issues. And the first issue I want to talk about is quite well known to everyone. And I'm sorry if you are tired of this question and this issue. We probably had to talk about this a lot in the last few months. But my first question is going to be about the elections. Recently we had the elections with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as candidates for the president. Where in every single election in America, it seems like it's the most important election of a lifetime, and it seems like if you choose wrongly this time, then it's gonna be fascism, it's gonna be an apocalypse, and every time they choose the other party, like basically the same shit happens. So recently I've been actually caught in a quite heated arguments with some of my far left-leaning friends when I told them that I would not ever vote for the Democrats because I would not vote for a party that actively commits genocide. And they, so I would say I would not vote at all or vote for a third party. Well, I have been called an accelerationist, and I have been called someone who, feels smug about having a moral high ground, but it actually leads to very bad consequences because apparently all leftists are supposed to always choose the lesser evil. Well, let me just draw a quick parallel here between the Weimar Republic, where the Social Democrats told people to support social democracy instead of communism because social democracy was the lesser evil. Then they told them to support the Brüning dictatorship instead of to support the Brüning dictatorship because it was the lesser evil than the Nazis. Then they told them to vote for Hindenburg because it was lesser evil than Hitler. And then Hindenburg made Hitler chancellor. So does supporting lesser evil work? Are leftists supposed to vote for the Democrats in the US? Did you vote for the Democrats? Did you vote at all? And is the US electoral system, can the US electoral system be used in the interests of the working class at all? Or should working class in the US completely abandon the idea of using the electoral system for their advantage?
Well, I voted for Kamala Harris because she's just the perfect communist that anyone could look up to. She's just amazing. I don't know how anybody would disagree with the fact. She's part of the Democratic Party, which is, obviously very democratic because it's in its name. So it must be very socialist. And that's all I do. I just, I don't like to think about politics. I just think Kamala Harris is a good socialist, and I think the Democratic Party has the interest of the working class at heart. And I just vote once every 4 years and wish that socialism will somehow happen in my lifetime. So
All right,
next question.
then.
Yeah, so of course not. So, my goodness, yeah, it's just this lesser evil crap. I think there's a couple of things I want to say here. First is the presidential election isn't the only election that's available to the American people here to vote for. There's all kinds of elections to vote for. There's local elections, state elections, and obviously presidential and elections all the way up to the top. And I think those degrees matter because I think voting locally has a much more progressive element to it in the interest of the working class than, say, the presidential election. Again, the presidential election, the popular vote doesn't really count. The president here isn't elected by the actual numbers of regular, normal people voting. They get delegates and super delegates that vote them in. So there's been plenty of times where the majority of people have voted for one presidential electorate or candidate, and but then the other candidate won because the delegates and super delegates voted them in. I don't know. This is a basic fact of presidential elections, and I don't know why people still try. I mean, there's this idea that people can vote to let their delegates know who to vote for, but in the end, it's up to the delegates and super delegates and whoever they're influenced by to vote. And that's why they can go against the popular majority vote at any time, and often do. But then voting locally and even on a state level, I think there's more of an impact there. But then if you are voting and participating in these they're all bourgeois elections. If the working class is participating in these bourgeois elections, what is the purpose of doing so? And I think to ask the question, oh, well, to vote in socialism, well, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. I'll get into different class democracies, such as bourgeois democracy and working class democracy in a moment. But to vote socialism into existence, into a country that is dominated by a bourgeoisie dictatorship, a capitalist country, let alone a capitalist imperialist country, to vote in socialism, it's just never been done. It's Marxists historically have said that this could never be done. Billionaires, millionaires, and soon to be trillionaires would never allow them or their class to be overthrown by a simple vote. That would never happen. It's kind of ridiculous that people still think that it does happen. And kind of a second point to this is, we not only do we have this division of classes, predominantly the main two classes are the bourgeois class or the bourgeoisie and the working class or the proletariat. Then we also have to take into account the role of the state, the government. Historically, Marxists have called it the state. And what is the purpose of the state? What is the role of the state? Well, the state, again, if we're participating in elections, we are participating in elections that are ruled, controlled, and dictated by the state. And the role of the state is to ensure that the dominant ruling class at that time stays in power, right? It helps manage all the contradictions within the ruling class, but also contradictions throughout society between classes. So if the working class or proletariat ever get out of hand, protests get too crazy, the state comes in, it manages everything, right? The state comes in, it manages property, it protects rich people, etc. So if you're voting, you're essentially participating in this state. Just a side note, the state could be in the service of the working class, and that's the period of what we call socialism, and we'll probably get into that later. So again, when I say ruling class doesn't automatically mean the bourgeois class, but in a capitalist society, the bourgeois class is the ruling class. In socialism or socialist society, the ruling class is actually the working class. Now, I think this is probably the last point I want to touch on, is that when it comes to democracy in relation to different classes in society, and in a capitalist society, there's obviously the two main classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So if the bourgeoisie is in power, then we have mainly what's called bourgeois democracy. So democracy amongst the bourgeoisie. And if there is democracy amongst the bourgeoisie, then there is the opposite for the working class. There is no democracy, or very, very little democracy for the working class in the proletariat. It'd be vice versa, kind of somewhat vice versa in a socialist society, but it won't be exactly the same. It's a bit more complicated, but the idea is kind of still there. So right now we live in a bourgeois democracy, and the bourgeoisie, they do have democracy amongst themselves, and there is a little benefit to that, because with bourgeois democracy you have bourgeois right, and a lot of those rights and privileges can somewhat trickle down to the working class. I think one example of that is that we can openly talk about socialism, communism, Marxism, anarchism, whatever, here in the US. And part of that is protected by free speech, and free speech is a bourgeois right. Now, bourgeois democracy can change into basically two different forms. It either go more rightward and become a fascist society, and therefore bourgeois democracy will be smashed, and then it will become a fascist society. And a fascist society is mainly, there's a lot of debate on this, but I take the idea that fascism is taking all the most reactionary elements of the bourgeois class and consolidating them, and them having kind of taking power in society. So bourgeois democracy can either go down the fascist route, or it can be overthrown and become a socialist society. Where we will have something called the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a whole thing to get into, but it's basically democracy for the majority of people in society, which is the working class. So back to like elections and what we voted for. Like you have in the US, we have two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and they both serve the ruling class. They're both different outlets for the ruling class to manage their affairs, their differences, their contradictions, and so it's all of the ruling, any class, there's always contradictions within it. And here in the bourgeoisie, in the US bourgeoisie, there are many different contradictions, many different ideas, many different perspectives. And the Democrats and the Republicans kind of filter different ideas into these two major political parties. So which part of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, wants to kind of dictate or become the dominant part of the ruling class for the next 4 years. And they'll do that through one of these major political parties, the Democrats or Republicans. And just to give you a practical answer, like example of this is in the recent election with Kamala Harris and Trump, but even going back to the one before that with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, a major issue amongst the ruling class is how do we deal with China's rise economically and becoming a capitalist imperialist power. Because a section of the bourgeoisie here was really tied up in having a lot of their factories in China for very cheap labor and manufacturing practices and whatnot. And then there's another section of the bourgeoisie here that did not have a lot of manufacturing in China. And these two sections of the bourgeoisie were really fighting it out through both the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think the Republicans, represented by Trump, they wanted to really cut off China and start to add these tariffs and import taxes, and just do it immediately, which Trump has done since becoming president recently for the second time. And the Democrats, represented by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, wanted to kind of have a different policy of slowly decoupling, slowly starting to break off these ties to China. And it looks like the section of the ruling class that wanted to immediately break these ties with China won, as represented by Trump and the Republicans. So I think that's a practical example to explain how elections work, how the working class kind of what they can do to impact elections. I will actually say there is one more thing, because you asked, how should we engage with elections? Now, there is an idea that is not so popular in communist circles here that I do think is worth experimenting with and seeing how it can be done. When elections happen, especially the presidential elections, it is a pretty important and vital moment to really start talking about politics and the problems in society and offering solutions. And communists right now in the US are so small that our voices are never heard. I mean, you could have Marxism Today has over 80,000 subscribers. That's probably one of the better YouTube channels with that many views that actually have good politics.
Yeah, not even all of these people are Americans, right? So it doesn't even apply to the US completely.
So, but that's, I mean, to us, that's maybe a very large number, so 80,000 subscribers, but that is almost nothing. That's so difficult to get to, but you're nowhere near the national discussion that's happening, like the presidential elections and what the hell these candidates are talking about. And so to engage with elections, it might, there's some talk about, there's always been talk about this, but creating a labor party. And I know it's different for other countries. They do have labor parties or whatnot, but to have a labor party that is probably multi-tendency but definitely has a large influence over the communist ideas that can be implemented or discussed or thrown out to this national discussion when elections come. That might be a good idea to really experiment with. And that would be one way to engage with elections as a communist, as a Marxist, to really use that platform to expose the ruling class, the bourgeois class, and both of its main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And not only to expose them, but to put out the interests of the working class, to really start showing this division of what are the interests of the working class, what are the interests of the bourgeoisie in the state right now. And to do that on a national level. It might be one of the only ways to do so is to kind of have something like a labor party that can engage with these national discussions during presidential elections, and because we just don't have that voice at all at that level. So yeah, I think those are some of the points that I would say when it comes to elections.
Yeah, makes sense. And your last point reminds me, I recently finally read Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder by Lenin. That's where he expands on this idea. I mean, he doesn't really expand on it, but he mentions the idea of using parliamentarism as a tool of exposing the bourgeoisie and just using it tactically. But again, it's always this idea of not always voting for the lesser evil, but looking for different, unorthodox way of engaging with bourgeois politics instead of, because this idea of, vote blue no matter who because Trump is gonna be worse, it just incentivizes Democrats to not change at all and just incentivizes people into like political numbness, into being like, we cannot change anything, so I'm just gonna vote for these guys and that's it, right? So I don't think this is what communists should do. But unfortunately, as you said, communists don't really have a big media outlet to influence people. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, which hopefully can be solved in the future. I saw there was this Katrina and someone else there were these two girls candidates, and they were raising some of these socialist issues to the public. I don't remember the details about this. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Maybe, perhaps, yeah.
They always run candidates at the presidential elections, and it's not too promising. So yeah, PSL is probably one of the most well-known, somewhat socialist parties in the U.S. But I would argue my perspective and experience, and this has been said from many different communists across the country for long periods of time now, that it's a really bad organization, that they have really funky politics. They're definitely revisionist. They support China today is one big major point. And very anti-democratic within the organization, because I've met a lot of members who used to be in the organization, and they left because they weren't allowed to ask certain questions, especially in regards to China or something like that. And they're kind of just like been told to toe the line, to follow the orders from the Central Committee and whatnot, and really shut down different discussions, democratic discussions. But regardless, they run candidates every presidential election. They use identity politics mainly. They'll try to get like a brown or black woman specifically to run and say like, oh, we're progressive here, so and so. And then, I don't know. Their points that they make are very basic, and I think it could work to a certain degree, but because of their political line and their politics are always in command, hence the name of my podcast, they really have shitty politics, bad politics, and so that's going to come out in the way that they engage with the elections and the kind of political points that they kind of put out there. It's really not so great. It's not a Marxist perspective. It's not a communist perspective or ideas. They're putting out revisionist ideas, and what it really practically looks like is just them complaining about how society is bad and how the bourgeoisie is bad, and that's just not enough. They're not really providing good, practical, solid solutions that the American working class can actually understand.
Right. Okay. It's taking a lot of time, so let's move to another question. But one thing I will comment on is thank you for tying the perspective on elections and bourgeois parties to actual underlying economic processes, because Trump won, the Democrats were there, and a lot of people are saying like, Trump is controlled by the Russians. Well, actually, the Democrats are controlled by the Zionists, and these people are controlled by Chinese, and these people, it's a lot of these identity politics. It's a lot of conspiracy theories. It's a lot of focusing on purely social issues, and very rarely they talk about very obvious stuff, which is what you said, for example, the conflict between sections of the bourgeoisie, where one bourgeoisie is more focused on the international kind of domination, and the other one that wants to close up a little bit and build up their own forces inside of the US, and instead of merging with China, they want to compete more directly. I think this is a point that is very often overlooked or like just completely ignored in mainstream narratives. But so thank you for that. And I'm gonna move to another question, which is a bit of a follow-up because we are talking about the US and talking about politics and talking about mainstream politics. So was there ever widespread support for communism in the US? Were there any communist sentiment? When did it appear and why? In which sections of the population and why did it disappear? Were there any parties that managed to get noticeable support and managed to actually organize the masses in any meaningful way? Are there any relevant parties or organizations now? If not, what went wrong? How did they lose support if the conditions in the USA keep getting worse?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I will say that there's been two, you could say, revolutionary periods in the US that were impacted by the ideas of communism. That was in, I think the highest peak of communism in the US ever was in the 1930s and 40s, right before World War II, in the build up to World War II. After World War II, things changed. And then the second largest communist period was during what's called the long 60s. So the 1960s, 1970s, think of Black Panther Party and all that kind of stuff. So those are the two major points of history that had like the most highest levels of communists and communist activities and whatnot. And yeah, it's interesting. So with the 1930s and 40s at its peak in this country, it's really worth looking into the history of the revolution in Russia, where the Soviet Union came into power and the Bolsheviks came into power, going back to 1917, right? And then the impacts that revolution had worldwide, especially on the working classes of the entire world. So that definitely influenced the U.S., where about 25 years after that, communism reached its peak. And during the 1930s, capitalism had these huge economic recessions and depressions worldwide. And, interesting fact of history here, while the capitalist world was definitely being hurt and the working classes of the world in those capitalist countries definitely taking the brunt of those costs during that time, the Soviet Union and its economy was actually growing. So, people started to notice this. And so communist ideas really started to gravitate towards the working classes around the world, but particularly here in the U.S. And so you can imagine that kind of appeal in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and then to build up to World War II. And even the U.S. at the time, President Roosevelt, allying with the Soviet Union to fight the Nazis. There's a lot of things happening during that time that the working class could openly start to be more attracted to communist ideas. And it was largely organized by the Communist Party USA, or sometimes called CP USA. They still exist today, but they're completely revisionist. During World War II, they went down a really bad revisionist route and just has become worse, where they just endorse the Democratic Party today. That's all they do. So, and then the second period was during the 1960s, and the impact there was China's Cultural Revolution. China was had just become a socialist country, but then they started the thing called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, kicked off in 1966. Among other things that were happening here in the U.S., you had the Civil Rights Movement. You had people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., all kinds of movements were happening here. You also had decades of the white American working class in the Appalachian Mountains fighting a bunch of battles in the coal mines, in the coal industry. All kinds of things were happening. But anyways, the Cultural Revolution is probably one of the biggest things that influenced the left here in the U.S. during the 60s and 70s. It influenced the Black Panther Party. It influenced the Revolutionary Union, or what later became the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP. And they were more Maoist back then. It was a really good communist organization when it first started, but then it turned into a revisionist organization in the late 70s and whatnot. And they call themselves the RevComs now to kind of distinguish themselves from their history. So yeah, those are my point is, communism has always been in the U.S. since Lenin. I mean, even going back to the 19th century, there was a lot of German Marxists that came over and fought in the U.S. Civil War in 1861 to 1865. There's even somewhat of a commune that was established in St. Louis around that time that was influenced by a lot of the German Marxists and Western European or just European Marxists that came over to the U.S. Anybody knows this history, there's a lot of peasants from Europe that then that moved to the U.S. that became the working class and the proletariat, because that's when the U.S. working class really started to explode and develop, was in the late 19th century. So ever since then, ever since Marx, Marxism and communism has been in the U.S. and it's had some peaks and it's definitely had some low levels. But it's always been around. So to say, and then to say Marxism and communism has always been here. But I will say, since World War II, like I said, Roosevelt allied with Stalin to fight the Nazis, but then the U.S. ruling class really did a 180-degree turnaround and developed this huge anti-communist apparatus to really go after anyone who had communist ideas anywhere in America, and started to do this witch hunting. It's famous. There's some movies that's been made about how there's been some communist sympathizers or even underground organizers in the movie industry and the entertainment industry, and some of them being hunted down by the government, losing their jobs, getting thrown in jail. Some of them even being executed. And those remnants of history still exist today in U.S. society. So there's still a lot of communist ideas, communists in society, but there's also a lot of anti-communism that the bourgeois state perpetuates and creates and manufactures that still influence a lot of people.
Right. I don't know if I have any follow-up questions to this. I think it's mainly good to hear that, communism is usually painted as inherently anti-American, but it really seems that communism has been a part of American history for a long time now. And that the only reason why it didn't, probably the biggest reason why it didn't become bigger thing is the covert and overt persecution of communists, which was absolutely relentless and lasted decades. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. But it also ties nicely into another question that I have, and I'd like to preface this question with a short story that I have read in the autobiography of Ray Manzarek, the great and famous keyboard player of the legendary band The Doors, where he and Jim Morrison, they were film students at UCLA, and he writes that he has been in a discussion with some other students, which Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek didn't really like John Wayne, and the other students really like John Wayne movies. And that's how the story goes. Some of the students said, "I like John Wayne better than Marlon Brando." Ray says, "He's got a rod up his ass, his walk is ridiculous," and so on and so on. They were undeterred. It's John Wayne's best movie. We snorted in derision. John Wayne never made the best movie. He's a racist jock. He's a friend of Ronald Reagan's, for Christ's sake. Their witty rejoinder, pressed to the limits of their critical abilities. He's an American and a patriot. We laughed. Why don't you go to University of Southern California where you belong, fascist? That always hurt them. We knew that the phrase true American patriot, ad Christian, was really unspoken code for fascist white supremacist. And they knew that we knew. And there was nothing they could do about it except to call us communists. So I like this story because it really shows that how quickly Americans can go to calling someone a communist. So here we see an example of some people that disliking John Wayne movies because he and his movies are inherently racist, and they don't care that he is a patriot of America, and they are immediately being labeled as communists, like straight to communism, right? So is communism inherently anti-American? Like, can the idea of American and communism be reconciled? Are you a traitor to America by subscribing to communist ideology? And like the American identity and state are so largely based on the idea of freedom and anti-communism that, as I asked, is communism reconcilable with the idea of American?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me just say, I don't know, we have to answer the question of what does it mean to be an American, right? America refers to the United States of America and the people within it. And so what is this country? What is this nation? What is the nation state? These are questions we should be answering without going into too much detail. Every nation in the world today is made up of classes. And in the period of, and nations have not been around for that long, only a few hundred years, really only during the era of capitalism. The bourgeoisie and capitalism and its economic mode of production required nations to exist. Of course, people, tribes, communities have always been around, but nations are a very particular thing, and the American nation is even more of a particular, specific thing that exists today in a part of the world and makes up about 5% of the entire world population, I believe. Maybe even 4% now. But so this nation is something that is drawn into existence by the bourgeoisie for the interests of the bourgeoisie, and therefore it continues, unless there's a socialist revolution, it continues to be a capitalist, bourgeois-dominated, bourgeois dictatorship of a nation. And so to say that I'm an American and that I love America in general is to say I love the bourgeoisie, I have the bourgeoisie's interests at heart, and I serve the bourgeoisie. Like, I serve my nation means to serve the bourgeoisie. That's what it really means. And so there's a part of America, I mean, this is, I guess, to even go to a more shorter answer, there's a part of America that I hate, and there's a part of America that I love. The part of America that I hate is generally the bourgeoisie. The part that I do love is generally the working class. I want to have the working class interests at heart. That is a part of, we're all products of some nation. Most of us in this world today are all products influenced and conditioned by our nation that we were raised in. I think some of us on the left, even some communists and principal communists, become a bit too dogmatic about it. Maybe in future generations, I mean, I know for a fact, like in future generations, when there's more socialist nations and communism starts to come into existence, nationalism will be a thing of the past that will be looked at as something kind of disgusting. But right now, we're not going to be living in that world, in the future. So right now, I think it's better just to admit that we do have a lot of these national cultural influences. And it's fine. But more importantly, like, what are the class interests behind these habits, these ideas, these urges, these things that I want to do or should do? They all come from some type of a class-based idea. And so do I have class-based ideas that are in the interest of the bourgeoisie, or do I have class-based interests in or ideas in the interest of the working class? I want to figure out what these class positions are, and I want to try to align myself as much as possible with working class interests here in the U.S. And that sometimes, there's some cultural differences between working classes across the world. And so, I mean, I am very much I would be proud of American working class interests. And I know that the proletariat is international at this point, and we should strive to disregard national differences between us. Obviously, yes, we should do that. But I'm also trying to admit that there are a lot of cultural influences that I have here in the US that will probably remain with me for the rest of my life. And I shouldn't try to just like be dogmatic and say those don't exist or have any influence on me whatsoever. But, I try to align them with the working class as much as possible. And so when they say that communism is anti-American, if you're pro-working class, then you must be anti-American. You must be a communist. If you're against the bourgeois interest, specifically the American U.S. bourgeoisie interests, then you're a communist. But, I mean, from that perspective, from the bourgeois perspective, it really just doesn't make sense. Like I said, we got to find these classes in society and show the differences in the interests of the working class and the bourgeoisie, try to align ourselves with the interests of the working class. And by doing that, because of what's happened in this country, we are going to be called anti-American. But we're not. We're actually standing up for the majority of the Americans in this society, which is the working class. Somewhere around 50%, if not more, of this population are working class. And that's the largest class in society. The bourgeoisie can make up less than 10%. Then you have a lot of petty bourgeois class elements. You have a lot of lumpen elements. So, I mean, it's kind of weird to say, but it's almost like saying like, well, I am actually pro-American in some regards because I'm in the interest of the majority of the people in this society, which is the working class. And those interests prove that they want to overthrow capitalism. They want to implement socialism. They want to implement democracy for the majority. They want to implement a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat to move society, change society, start implementing these technologies that can solve the problems for most of the people in society, have an influence, peaceful, friendly relations with other countries that do want to have the same interests at hand, and just overthrow this wretched system of capitalism that has been, destroying the people around the world, destroying their environment, and there's just no long sustainable future with that in mind. So yeah, anyways, before I start rambling on anymore, that's what I would say with the whole idea is if communism is anti-American or not.
Right, so it seems what the ruling classes are really trying to do, and they are trying to very hard to do this, is to put an equal sign between the idea of America and the ruling class interests. And that basically that's their whole game, to basically make you disregard classes completely, disregard all class interests, and just completely identify the idea of America with the idea of the ruling classes. And it seems like there is much more to the idea of America and American than just this. But I just very quickly comment recently, I'm actually working on translating this for my channel. One of Michael Parenti's speeches, when he mentions that during the New Left movement, a lot of people would, and during the anti-Vietnam protests, a lot of people would burn the US flags. And whether this is right or wrong or moral or not to do this is besides the question, because the effect of that was that, the ruling classes, they would see that and they would play the clip on the media of some people burning the US flags, and then they could say, oh, you can see these people are anti-America, right? But they are not really anti-America, they are anti-war, and they are they don't want to be slaves of the corporations, and they don't want to die in a pointless war. But they are playing right into the hands of the ruling classes, because it's very easy to antagonize them, to just say these people who are really against the ruling classes and their interests, you can just say they are anti-America, right? So
exactly. So the patriot, just one quick point, the patriotism and the nationalism, I mean, really in most countries around the world, it's very strong. Particularly, I'm more familiar with the US. I'll give you one example. There's even, I'm pretty sure in the countries that you've been in, other countries, I know this for a fact, that people of the world know about the influence of the military here in the US, about military soldiers and troops, about military veterans, like this whole idea about war, military, veterans, service, troops, soldiers. It's just a very big influence on the national discussions of what America is, especially in regards to this idea of American nationalism or patriotism. So 9% of the US population are veterans. Actually, let me back up. Less than 1% are active duty soldiers and troops that are actually in uniform, that are actually in the military right now, less than 1%. Now, after you get out of the military, you become what's known as a veteran, that you once served in the armed forces. You've been in the Army, Navy, Marines, or Air Force. Sorry, I almost forgot the other branch. And veterans make up about 9% of the population here. And then if you add up all the family members who have veterans in their families, that comes out to about 1/3 of the US population, which is nearly 100 million people. It's something ridiculous like that. So you have 100 million people who have veterans or active duty troops or soldiers in their family that help spread this very easily, ideas of nationalism and patriotism on a very personal level. And so that's a large section of the population. Not to mention all the other forms of propaganda and the ideological struggles that the bourgeoisie wages to influence people about describing what America is, which is the bourgeois interest, so on and so forth. So I think that's something to consider, to think about. And it's always good for everyone from their own country, their own nation, to really dive into how the bourgeoisie perpetuates its own interests through nationalism or patriotism in their own country. Because we have an American exceptionalism here, but I'm sure there's Polish exceptionalism, there's French exceptionalism, there's now Chinese exceptionalism. All these countries say they're the best country in the world and why it is. But really, it's the bourgeoisie saying what their interests are, and they want everyone to follow suit and toe the line.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, nationalism, one of the strongest tools that the bourgeoisie can use. Well, we've seen that happen during the First World War, and we might see that happen again. But let's continue.
Yes.
Another question is, staying in the topic of nationalities and nations. Are Americans a nation? Is American really a nationality? And I'll give a little bit of background because some people might be very confused by this question. The US has always been and still is a settler colonial project. And settler colonial projects are a bit different than regular nation states because they are nations of the oppressor, they are nations of the settlers. So what happened, after the revolution of the US Revolution, after the bourgeoisie fought for their independence from the British Kingdom, they imported black slaves and white proletariat, and they expanded their territory into land that belonged to the natives. And so you have these three large groups: the white settlers, the descendants of black slaves, and the descendants of the colonized natives. And basically what happens now is these people are, after decades of racial segregation, now this has ended. Now they, at least nominally, have equal rights, but still it is a little bit insulting that they can only be considered an American if they accept the white settler way of life, really. So what I'm getting at is nationalities. Nations are people who have the same language, same economical sphere of activity. They have same psychological makeup, and they have common history. But it seems like the white settlers, Native Americans, and black people, first of all, they don't really have a common history because, for example, the black people and white people in America is really the history of oppressors and the history of the oppressed. So depending on which your point of view is, these are quite different histories, to be honest. And another thing is, well, they might have a common language and a common economical activity, but the psychological makeup of these two groups of people is kind of different. It used to be way different in the past, especially during the times of segregation. And today we are still at the situation where, for example, Native Americans, if they want to be considered fully American, they need to kind of let go of their national identity as Native Americans. It's best for them to, wear a suit, get a loan for a house in the suburbs, get a car, and they are now considered a normal American, right? But their culture, their history, it's not gonna be promoted. Another example, for example, might be that the black culture, the culture for a long time, it was the culture of the white people was the culture of the oppressor. So the oppressed people did not want to emulate that because it was the culture of the people who oppressed them. But the black culture, for example, was the culture of the oppressed. So the oppressors looked down upon that. So they didn't want to have anything to do with them. So black culture was looked down upon until some people figured out that, for example, rap is gonna be very profitable. So they promoted it, but not to celebrate black culture, but just to make money off of that. So basically my question here is the concept of American nationality, is this real? Is this one actual nationality? Or should we look at native population and black Americans as separate nationalities? And if there was a socialist state established on US territory, would that be a state of the American nation? Would that be a state of many different nationalities, or would all these nationalities need separate socialist states to actually get actual autonomy?
So this is a very important question. To fully answer it probably takes several months, if not a few years of studying, debate, discussion, as well as some type of practical form of trying to experiment with different practices of organizing, to really answer this question. But it is a question that I've been kind of personally interested in for a very long time, and I have studied it for a very long time. So I could give you my perspective, my ideas around this. I know that it's probably, I have a minority perspective on this compared to the rest of the left in the US. And this isn't something that I just want or have just wished or just magically think. It's actually come from like several years of studying and trying to answer this question. And so what I've come to, and I've also vacillated on different perspectives here over the years, but most recently, and this is the most solid conclusion that I have after years of studying, is that America is a nation. It's pretty clearly a nation. I mean, good luck going to an airport and trying to fly internationally without a passport that says you're from this country, and just say, oh, well, this isn't a legitimate nation. Well, it is. They control if you leave the country or not. That's pretty legitimate to me. So, I mean, because some of the ideas in your questions come from like a moral sentiment. What should have happened? What is right? What is wrong? That's good and all, but then there's also what is and what has happened objectively and what is going on. Again, this goes around the question of like, what is a nation? Nation is a formation, a horrific formation of a nation, of a territory, of a certain means of production dictated by a certain class. So what nation was created on earth that happened in a way that everyone just voluntarily joined that nation? There was no exploitation. There was no killing. There was no removing people from certain lands. There wasn't any type of oppression. What nation in this world today formed in that way? Like, it's a serious question that I think everyone listening should try to answer. What nation on this earth formed in this harmonious, peaceful way? There's not a single nation on earth ever throughout history that has ever formed into a nation that then had a nation state, or even if you're a nation without a state, without classes. And to have classes, there was exploitation and oppression. I mean, Marx talks very clearly about a lot of this in his ideas around primitive accumulation, which is like, this very initial and violent process by which a capitalist society is established. It's the historical moment where people are forcibly separated from their traditional means of subsistence, access to land and tools and other forms. And then forced to become dependent on wage labor. And this is all required to create a nation in the eyes of the bourgeoisie. So to say that, I think another important point here is that there's a conflation, a confusion, where there's two different types of things happening that people mix, but they don't separate, and most people do not clearly identify or define. One of those ideas is national oppression, and the other idea is racial oppression. And I think what happens here in the US, specifically with the current left movement here in the US, is if there's racial discrimination, then therefore that automatically means it's a form of national oppression. And I don't think that's correct. And I think this is a major point, a major weakness that Marxists and communists have, where I've done a lot of research and I've really looked up these different Marxist theories of national oppression, and you can find it. There's a lot of ideas about national oppression, about nations, how they formed, what they do, how they operate. And then I tried to look up Marxist theory of racism, and there is almost nothing out there. I think there's one guy who has written predominantly on it, named Harry Chang from the 60s and 70s, Asian American, and he has some works that I need to dive into a little bit more clearly, but it is a really interesting question to be like, well, what is the difference between racial oppression and national oppression? Does it automatically mean racial oppression means national oppression. Well, what happened historically in the communist movement, going back to the Comintern, when the Bolsheviks had was leading the International, they were back in the 20s and 30s, developed a committee to try to understand the situation for African Americans or Black people in general in the U.S. and to figure out if it's a form of national oppression. And yes, they did say that it was basically racial oppression, specifically for Black people, is a form of national oppression. Therefore, they are a nation, and we support this Black nation for liberation. And if, most so-called communists don't even know that history, but even the ones that do know that history, of course, they're going to follow what the Comintern said because it was the highest leading body within the communist movement in the world. But we have to ask the question, has the Comintern or any international ever had any wrong ideas? I think it would be ridiculous to say that they were correct 100% of the time. No one is like that, not even the best Marxists in the world, whoever that may be at whatever time, if that's ever possible. But I think in this case, the Comintern was actually incorrect. And they did not, I went back to the 1928 and 1930 Comintern resolutions that they wrote about this topic. They had people like Harry Haywood, which was a famous Black Marxist in the U.S. He's kind of the father of the Marxist conception of a Black nation and its fight for liberation. He was in the Soviet Union when these resolutions were passed in 1928, 1930. He even came back, influenced the Communist Party USA, and even wrote his own book about it, and then also tried to organize some new anti-revisionist parties in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, I mean, I think racial oppression is something different than national oppression. I think there's a lot of overlap there, obviously, but I don't think that means that a nation exists because someone is racially oppressed. So, in moving on to the next point, there's basically three big perspectives on this question of Black people, specifically in the U.S. One is that Black people have always been a nation. The second idea is that Black people used to be a nation, but are no longer a nation now. Say they were a nation during slavery, during sharecropping, but then once sharecropping ended, they were integrated into U.S. society and they were no longer a nation. And the third perspective is that Black people were never a nation by itself, ever. And I take the third position, that there's a really great 3-part series that was written by an organization in the 60s and 70s and 80s called Line of March. It's kind of difficult to find, but if you look hard enough, you can find it on Marxist.org. I think it's something about a communist analysis of the Black nation might be the title of it, but it's written by Line of March. They make several good points. Again, I can't touch on everything, but let's just go back to slavery and let's just imagine kind of the same idea, but let's just imagine other parts of it. Let's say the entire working class was Black and the entire bourgeoisie was white. Let's just imagine, even though that's never, ever been a reality. Let's just imagine that. Now, can you remove the working class from a nation and just create its own nation? Like, is that possible? Because I think that's what people imagine here when they think of Black liberation. Because there is this aspect that Africans were brought over here into slavery, and that slavery built up a lot of the wealth for the U.S. that benefited the bourgeoisie that was predominantly white. Historically, still is, majority-wise. And so there's this idea of just, well, if we were to remove all the Black people, we could create our own nation and be free. I don't think that's true. That wouldn't make sense. Because what does a nation require? It requires a bourgeoisie. It requires working class. Both of them together is what makes a nation, a capitalist society. And so it's kind of like, what if everyone was white? We just removed the white working class and created its own nation. That's not how it works. Even when there is a socialist revolution, and the bourgeoisie is overthrown and the working class is in power, there are still classes in a socialist society. The capitalists and the bourgeoisie are still in society. You still have to deal with that problem. There's so many problems you have to deal with during the socialist transition period, socialist construction period. So I don't think that Black people were ever a nation. I think there were attempts to build a Black nation, but the bourgeoisie crushed it. And one of the examples is the Tulsa Massacre, when there was this thing called a Black Wall Street, meaning that there was a fairly independent economy with different classes of Black people in that economy called the Black Wall Street. There's many Black Wall Streets in many different places in the country, but the most famous one was in Tulsa in the state of Oklahoma. Tulsa is a small town. And then in that town, there was like this section called Greenwood. And Greenwood was just, it was the land and businesses were all owned by Black people. There was Black millionaires. This is back in the 20s too. So to be a millionaire back then, and even a Black millionaire, it's just like being a billionaire today. And they ran Greenwood, they employed Black people. They were creating a nation of Black people. But the bourgeoisie just completely destroyed it, invaded and destroyed everything there, right? So, and that's just one of probably many examples that I think we could look at where the Black nation tried to, establish itself, but was crushed. But I think Black people have always been integrated into this nation. Again, a nation is something that is created by and maintained by force, by exploitation, by oppression, whether that's racial oppression or just basic class oppression or gender or sex oppression or whatever type of oppression or exploitation. It's happening. And I think there's a lot of, it's really fucked up U.S. history, especially what's happened to African and Black people in this country. And if we were really dedicated to helping and resolving those types of issues, racial oppression towards Black people, and I'll get to indigenous people in just a moment. I won't have that much to say, but if we really want to understand those issues, I think we should try to be as scientific as possible, to understand history and the current society as objectively as possible. And sometimes that means not agreeing with the majority of people. And in this case, I don't agree with the majority of people on the left here in the US. And I don't think the Black nation is a nation. And I think historically speaking, especially from the 60s and 70s, when you take Black communists, Marxists, organizers, and you strip them away from the overall working class communist Marxist movement, you're creating divisions in that communist Marxist movement that are unnecessary and unhelpful. Right now, we're at a time where we need to unite as many Marxists and communists as possible, as much as the working class as possible, even other segments of other classes, such as the bourgeoisie. I mean, hell, even if we win over some of the bourgeoisie itself, remember, Engels was part of the bourgeoisie, as you said earlier in this recording. We need to unite these people as much as possible. So creating these unnecessary divisions, actually, from my experience, but also historically speaking from what I've read, it just has not helped our movement that much. And again, the peaks of communism was when these ideas weren't so prominent. But they were, there were contradictions back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. They weren't so developed either. So Black people weren't we're kind of excluded in some regards in certain sections of the communist Marxist movement, which we need to address moving forward. But I think what happens is people overcorrect and just say, oh, the black nation is a nation and they should do their own thing and we shouldn't intervene, and I'm not black and I shouldn't have any right to speak about any of this. Well, you're being non-scientific about this and it's not very helpful. And it may lead you down incorrect ideas of what to do. So we need to have the courage to speak up about these things. And a lot of people who aren't black don't have the courage to say these things. And then there's a lot of people in the black community who are activists, organizers, even some of them may call themselves Marxists or communists, will openly tell non-black people to shut the hell up, that they don't have any right to talk about black people in this country. And that's a totally negative way to build unity and to spread correct ideas and have a democratic discussion and debate about these types of ideas moving forward. So I hope some of that makes sense. As far as indigenous people, yes, that is I think that's a totally different, separate question. I'm not going to go into it too much, but I think there was probably a time when indigenous nations existed or even could have formed to become more of a prominent nation, but then again was crushed. But today, I don't think indigenous nations exist. Some of them are on reservations, but when you look at the economics inside of these reservations, they're so integrated into the U.S. economy, to U.S. society at large in general, that there's just no independence of any of these, of the black people, of indigenous people, of Puerto Ricans or whatever. There's just no actual independence here. And we actually need to have that independence, especially economic independence. I will say one other thing. Culturally, like you mentioned, rap music, hip hop, stuff like that. There's all kinds of cultures in the U.S. There's Midwestern culture, Southern culture, New England culture, West Coast culture, and then even on smaller scale, smaller region, like Appalachian culture. Like there's all kinds of cultures in the U.S. Just because there's a different culture in a different region or section of the country doesn't mean you have the right to form a nation based off of that. A nation has many different types of subcultures within it. And I think, and even in the black community, there's a bunch of many different types of subcultures within the black community. And to kind of label black people as one culturally homogenous type of people is actually very kind of racist if you think about it, because you're not showing the diversity that the black community actually has all throughout the country. There are different types of black, and sure, they may share this overall racial oppression that they can go to any part of the country and receive, legally, culturally, economically, whatever. But there are many different types of cultures within the U.S. and, there are cultures within the veteran community. Should veterans just break off and form their own nation? I mean, some of these people were talking about this in the 60s and 70s. That's kind of ridiculous. So culturally speaking, I think that is, we shouldn't, that doesn't give you the right to just break off and form its own nation. So again, there's just so much to say here, and I'm sorry if that was too long, but it's a large question that I think needs to be continued to talk about more and more.
Yeah, thank you for this perspective. That was very interesting. I learned a lot of stuff I haven't known about. I didn't even know about the attempt by the commenter to approach this question. I might have some disagreements, but we're not gonna discuss it because first, we don't have time. Second of all, I didn't invite you here to push my own agenda. I really wanted to, I had this question in my mind for a long time and I didn't know the answer, and I really wanted to ask an American about this because I don't get to talk to Americans very often. One thing that most surprised me is how you say that the idea that I have put forward about black people and Native Americans being a separate nation, you said that this is seems to be kind of a mainstream view on the left, which really surprised me because I thought the left, especially like the older Marxist-Leninist organization, probably I would assume they're gonna be kind of chauvinistic and they're gonna outright reject the idea of these people needing a separate state structure or whatever. So I was kind of surprised that you mentioned that it is a more of a mainstream idea than I thought initially.
Well, the left is a general term and it's a relative term. So I think when I say the left here in the U.S., I may have a different conception of what the left means than what you may have. So to get in, and we don't need to get into it, but there are different sections within the left. I mean, like earlier, you used the term far left. I would disagree with that term. I think there's just left and pseudo left. Yeah, you're right. I think the point that you're making, though, overall, I do agree with that. There are different sections within the left. What I'm saying is, I think the people who have been opened up to and influenced by Marxism in specific, whether it's Marxism-Leninism, or MLM, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, I think those are the ones who are dominantly and majority-wise would say that the Black nation exists today. And those are the people that I would disagree with and be in the minority position.
All right,
so just
but that's actually quite surprising to me, to be honest. I would expect that among the Maoists, but not among the MLs. But then again, don't know much about American Marxists. Anyway, let's continue, because we are Marxists as professional yappers like to talk about lengths. So let's quickly, I don't really have follow-up questions to the previous one. So let's change the direction a bit. And let's stop talking about mainstream politics and nationalities, and let's ask a more broad question, which is the American empire coming to an end? A lot of people seem to think that the American empire is collapsing, especially now as China becomes more powerful and influential and seems to have ambitions to kind of take over the lead of the global economy. However, I myself think that the US is as strong as ever, because firstly, internal conflicts have existed in the USA since its inception, even during the era of post-war prosperity. So internal unrest does not mean that the US empire is gonna come crashing down soon. They always tell you that the US is more divided than ever. I'm thinking, like, have you ever heard about the Civil War? Like, it's not really true. Like, the US was always divided. Secondly, the ruling classes still own half of the world of neo-colonies. They have the biggest military machine ever created by humanity. They have all the instruments of death they want to have, and they are not gonna hesitate to use them if their power is actually threatened. But another thing that I'm thinking about, maybe the ruling classes have grown so decadent that they are really driving the country into the ground, and in their hubris and in their lack of understanding of what's actually happening, they are actually leading the US empire to its inevitable downfall. So would you say the US empire is actually crumbling down? Is this a possibility that within our lifetimes we're gonna see the end of the US empire, the end of bourgeois US state?
Man, I gotta say, your descriptions following the main questions are just so good. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm really
it highlights it really highlights the level and depth that you're thinking about these questions. I really appreciate this. You're doing good. I like it.
Thank you.
So is the American empire coming to an end? I don't know. Let me just lay out some basic facts that I think a lot of people forget. If I could name some of the top countries in the world that produce the most things, they're the top producers of most things in the world. They have the best technologies. They produce most efficiently. They make the most money. Like, say the top 5 countries in the world. Like, if you were betting on anything with, say, how many countries in the world? 93, and then even more technically speaking, a little over 100. If I had to bet on anything, I mean, it would be a wild bet to say anything in the top 5 is going to just fail in 100 different countries. My point is, America, even right now, is the number one largest economy in the world. It's the second largest industrial power in the world. It's the most powerful military in the world, not the largest. It depends on what you mean by large. But as far as size, it's not the largest. But as far as power, I would say yes. And the political and military influence it has around the world is number one. It would be wild for me to guess that, okay, this top dog that's been doing so great in its field and been at the top position for so long, I'm going to bet that this thing is just going to come crumbling down. Just kind of like reasonably or even logically thinking about it that way, it would be kind of wild to think about. But there is also this idea that all empires come to an end. They're born at one time and they end at another time. And that's certainly true. And so is something going to come crashing down immediately? I mean, there's a possibility for that to happen. Is it likely? I don't think so. I think the way that America is dealing with the rise of China shows that, especially with the policies by the Republican Party and Trump being elected to represent that section of the ruling class. They want to cut off ties as much as possible with China, and they want to bring industries back to America, which is actually maybe a good thing for the working class, because maybe we could use that as leverage to build the working class movement, to help spread Marxist, communist, and working class ideas throughout the country. But that's a whole nother set of topics to discuss. But my point is, the American bourgeoisie ruling class there's many reasons why they are in power. They do their homework. They stay on top of their game. They know what's going on in the world. They are making movements and adjustments for their interests, their benefits, to benefit their class. And they've been doing so, and they will continue to do so. I think the moves that they are making are definitely going to keep America in the top game for decades to come. Maybe towards the end of the century, something wild will happen. To me, the most wild thing that could happen and should happen is a socialist revolution, which would fundamentally change this country and also the influence that it has over other countries. And that could have a huge effect on the world. I think that's more likely than anything else for the rest of this century in our lifetimes.
Right, so it seems the US bourgeoisie is not as incompetent as many people think. As you said, they actually do their homework and they have been staying on top of the game for a while, not because they are stupid, but because they do exactly what they need to do to stay in that position. Well, another opinion that is quite common is that a lot of the empires fall at the height of their power, which I don't really know if that's true, and this is just wishful thinking for people to just say like, oh, the US is at the heights of its power, so it's surely gonna fall. Well, it's not a dialectical understanding of that. So,
well, the question is, how did they fall? And usually, if you look at it historically, it's usually by a class-led revolution. And that's why I think it's, the most likely situation is the socialist revolution.
But this is exactly the point of, to stay on top, the ruling classes, they also need to defend themselves from a revolution. They need to prevent it. And when the revolution happened, like what you see in the Tsarist Empire, you have unexperienced, undeveloped bourgeoisie, incompetent bourgeoisie, and you have really decadent ruling classes, right? Like you have Tsar Nicholas, who could industrialize the country, but instead he prefers to go partying with the other monarchical families in Europe, and he just like the point is you have this revolution. I think that was also the quote of Lenin when he said like revolution happens when the bourgeois classes grow decadent and they completely expose themselves and they lose any respect among the lower classes, and basically what you need to happen that plays into this idea of empires being at the height of their power when when these ruling classes are so powerful that they feel untouchable, and they feel like nothing and no one can threaten them, then they start getting reckless, or they are not careful, and suddenly you have a revolution that you didn't know that's gonna happen, but it was brewing all this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to get into. I'll try to sum it up here, though. It does go back to what I just said about like revolutions, and yeah, it could happen at somewhat a height of the power, but that may be debatable. But I still get the idea. The height of the American Empire, something's going to happen. So what happens, and going back to the Lenin quote, I think you're referring to, I think it is in Left-Wing Communism, in Infantile Disorder, where he says, he talks about the fundamental law of revolution is, actually, you know what? It's super easy to find. Let me just read that. So if I type in Lenin, the fundamental law of revolution, it should pop up. Yep. So let me just read this to you. This is a quote from Lenin. It is left-wing communism. Quote, the fundamental law of revolution, which has been confirmed by all revolutions, and especially by all three Russian revolutions in the 20th century, is as follows. For a revolution to take place, it is not enough for the exploited and oppressed masses to realize the impossibility of living in the old way and demand changes. For a revolution to take place, it is essential that the exploiters should not be able to live and rule in the old way. It is only when the lower classes do not want to live in the old way and the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way that the revolution can triumph. This truth can be expressed in other words. Revolution is impossible without a nation-wide crisis which affects both the exploited and the exploiters. It follows that for a revolution to take place, it is essential first that a majority of the workers, or at least the majority of the class-conscious, thinking, and politically active workers, should fully realize that the revolution is necessary and that they should be prepared to die for it. Second, that the ruling classes should be going through a governmental crisis which draws even the most backwards masses into politics. And it weakens the government and makes it possible for the revolutionaries to rapidly overthrow it. So that's a paragraph. Again, if you type in Lenin, the fundamental law of revolution, it always pops up. It's a very famous quote. So Lenin talks about that. That's also important. There's also other things that Marx highlighted where he says there is a revolution happens when there is a contradiction in the economic base of society. And the economic base, which is different than the ideological base, the political base. The economic base has two parts of it. One is the relations of production, and the other is the forces of production. And so basically the productive forces or forces of production is basically all the technology, knowledge, labor, all the scientists and engineers, all of it at a certain period of time, that represents the forces of production. The relations of production is how society is structured as far as how things are produced and the relations between people. So if you're a landlord and you have slaves, that is a relation of how things are going to be produced. If you are a capitalist and an owner of a factory and you hire wage laborers or the proletariat, then that is a relation of production, right? This throughout different types of class societies or all societies, you have an economic base that talks about these relations and forces of production. Now, when these two things come into contradiction is when Marx says a revolution can and will happen. And this is kind of what Lenin hints at, but in a more broad way. Marx is a bit more, I guess you could say, academic in the way that he speaks about this due to his writing style and historical period of which he was writing. But just to give you a practical layout of how this would play out today, do we not have all of these technologies that could solve world hunger? Right? We do. We have technologies for farming and all kinds of production that could efficiently both produce what we need, but also distribute and feed and give accessibility to people of what they need. Why isn't it being implemented? Well, there's the relations of production. And the relations of production don't want everyone fed. We have the capitalists and the imperialists in power. They don't want hunger to be solved. It's not in their interest to do so. They don't want to give out free stuff. So you have the relations of production coming into contradiction with what we have available, the forces of production that could do all kinds of wildly crazy positive stuff for the majority of the people on this world. So we have, and this plays out in so many different minute, specific, detailed, complex ways. We could go on all the types of contradictions that we have today. But I think everyone will start to get the idea is like, these things aren't like sustainable or renewable energies. Why isn't it being implemented? Well, you have relations of production, say the oil industry, that's preventing that from happening. And then you have people who want to have this so-called green revolution and say that, we are using renewable energies, but they want to keep it under the capitalist form of the relations of production, meaning they still want exploitation, they still want oppression. While using these so-called green technologies and whatnot. So my point is, these things are here. But I think going back to Lenin's quote, there needs to be something very significant that happens for a revolution to actually be successful. There has to be something a bit more specific and a bit more significant to happen. Is there, I like to ask a question when studying Marxist texts. Has there ever been a point in U.S. history of when this was a right time to have a revolution? When this, what Lenin called this nationwide crisis where the ruling class can't rule in the old way and the lower classes can't live in the old way? Some people will say COVID. Maybe that was a good time to have a revolution. Some people will say 2008 recession. Some people will say World War II. Some people will say the 1930s economic depression. And then there's also a different perspective. Maybe there hasn't been something bad enough compared to what Lenin and the Bolsheviks and Russians went through to really call for this to happen. Because not only does this horrible nationwide crisis need to happen with the contradictions between the relations of production and the forces of production, but there also needs to be a strong section of the subjective forces being the Marxists, the communists, and the working class movement being strong enough, ready, in position for war, essentially, ready for revolution, ready to take advantage of that nationwide crisis. Right now, we may have those contradictions between the relations of production and the forces of production here in the US, but we don't have a nationwide crisis large enough, and we don't have the subjective forces, which is the Marxist, communist, and working class movement, strong enough or ready to take advantage of such a thing. And to build up to that level, I think would take, at best, 1 decade, if not a few decades. It's very long-term work. We're going to have to buckle down. It's very difficult. The odds are against us. But then again, the odds were against the Chinese when they waged their revolution. The odds were against the Bolsheviks when they waged their revolution. So things are very possible in those extreme circumstances.
Right. I'll use this opportunity to tell anyone who might be still listening at this time that if you want to understand the crisis that we're talking about here, the deep crisis that makes it impossible for the bourgeoisie to keep on running their system and for the lower classes to continue living as they were living, you really need to study the period between 1913 and 1939. That is, I think, something that's not understood well enough. I think a lot of Marxists, especially beginner Marxists, they like to focus on stuff that on revolutions that succeeded: the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and there's gonna be a lot of anarchist tendencies. We're gonna focus on the Spanish Revolution, maybe. But I think the whole period, the interwar period leading to the 1930s crisis, the Great Depression, in 1929, I think it started, and the general experience of the German Revolution, I think this is a blueprint of what might happen, of what can happen, and of what can go wrong in an industrially developed country. And I don't really hear Marxists talk much about the German Revolution, and if some leftists talk about the German Revolution, I think they largely do not understand what really happened, also because they don't understand it fully holistically. One research that I cannot recommend enough is the RP Dutt book called Fascism and Revolution, which I am actually translating now, and I'm gonna upload an audiobook on my channel soon enough. But I think we really need to study this period, and that's how we can understand how such a crisis might happen and how it might go down, and what forces will be at play to drive the revolution forward and to try to stop it. But anyway, let's
good point.
Let's continue, because this is taking a very long time now. So I'm gonna skip one question. I'm gonna move to another question, which I guess was mostly answered. But if you want to expand on that, the question is basically, is revolution in the USA possible? You know, today we have a lot of people who basically give up on the idea of a successful revolution happening in the imperial core, and they just assume that the working class of the imperial core must be liberated by revolutions in the third world, because in the imperial core the power of the bourgeoisie is just too much. And so basically the question is the revolution in the USA possible? I guess you already answered that it kinda is, but it requires a massive event that will actually trigger the situation. Another question is, do you think this might happen within our lifetime? And what is your opinion about this, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, yes, a revolution is possible. In the U.S., it's possible in, I don't know if I said impossible. It is possible, yes. There should be a revolution in the U.S., and there can be. There can be a revolution in any country in the world. And I think what you're referring to is this large sentiment of people who believe that revolutions are only possible in third world countries. It's usually labeled as third worldism. And, I dabbled in it for a while and kind of thought in that way for a little bit. But, and I still, third worldism is very popular here in the US. It's very unfortunate because that ideology, that perspective really just drains the revolutionary energy from the movement here in the US. And those people don't believe that revolutions can happen in places like the US. And I can kind of understand where some of them are coming from, because if you look historically, revolutions have really only happened in some of the poorest countries in the world historically, right? At least working class revolutions. And it has yet to be really used in a larger, more powerful country, like imperialist countries. Russia was kind of an anomaly where it was imperialist, but one of the backwards economies of the world at the time. But it is a blueprint that it could happen in an imperialist country, a different kind of imperialism, but nonetheless. So I understand where they're coming from. I think what happens is there's a lack of creativity when implementing Marxist communist ideas into our organizing efforts. And we have a lack of creativity because we have an actual lack of fundamental understanding of Marxism and communism and what socialism actually is. And if we have a lack of that, then we can't be creative with it. And if we're not creative with it, we just fall back onto what has happened historically. And and what has happened historically is that there hasn't been a revolution in a powerful country like the US. So how do we implement a revolution? How do we build the working class movement, the communist movement? How do we implement these Marxist ideas? We have to figure out, and this is what all great Marxists and communists have done in other successful revolutions, is they've attuned and applied Marxism to their particular conditions. Every country has its own particular conditions. Germany and the US can both be capitalist imperialist countries, but we are very two different countries. That's going to require different ways of organizing. I mean, some of it's going to be similar, but it's also going to require a lot of different ways of implementing these Marxist ideas, because we have formed historically in different ways. We are made up of different components, and we have different cultures and all this particularities. But in general, we really need to be creative and learn how to apply and test out and learn patience and understand all the intricate, all the specificities and particularities of how we organize. And it's hard to do. It's really, really hard to do. And a lot of the exploitation is kind of overlooked or out of sight. Some people can't see it. And like I said, the ideological struggle here could be maybe even more difficult, because in third world countries, it's pretty easy to see people in a sweatshop that can barely live and pay for food, let alone have access to clean water or something like that. It's very clear to see, when it's not so clear to see here in the US. But nonetheless, in the end, I think it's definitely is. Revolution, saying that revolution is not possible in the US, it hasn't been proven to me. It's just some sentiment that people have had because they've given up. They're like, I can't figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, if
I'm gonna leave it.
Believe really hard that the revolution is impossible, then surely it will be impossible, right?
Of course. And if you quit searching for ideas, being creative, trying to build things, what happens is, if you're going to be a lifelong organizer, you're going to fail 90% of the time. And so the question is, are you going to continue to organize and learn from those mistakes and do something different? And that takes a lot of patience, a lot of hard work, a lot of dedication. And I think a lot of people, what happens is, they study Marxism for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and they say, oh, I got it figured out. I know the answers. Let me implement this. Let me start organizing. And then when everything you've done failed, you're kind of like, okay, this isn't possible. I'm not going to believe it. And that's not what Mao did and the Chinese communists did. I mean, they failed for decades. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in 1921. They didn't really take power to 1949. And then it was still almost a decade later until they actually started to construct socialism. So it took Mao's entire lifetime to even turn China into a socialist country. And they failed. They had so many people killed throughout those decades of fighting and waging a revolution.
I think this is very important, especially to mention Mao. And because first of all, the Communist Party of China was almost wiped out before the Long March, and they abandoned their base and they moved across the entire country to start over. And that sure as hell must have been demotivating, but they learned from the failure. But another point about Mao is how he was a bit sidelined after some of the failures of the Great Leap Forward. He was sidelined. He lost, right? He wasn't always the the main leader. He was a bit sidelined.
He was in the minority position for a very long time, many times.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. And he learned from his mistakes and he kept fighting. And that's where we see the Cultural Revolution is him coming back with him learning from his failures and having new ideas, trying to push them forwards against the people who want to steer the revolution towards the capitalist road. So that is very important, that he failed. He did not become didn't become bitter. He didn't become hopeless. He learned. He kept learning. He always kept learning. That's very important.
Yeah, and he has a quote in, I think maybe On Practice, in his piece called On Practice. He says, "Failure is the mother of success."
It's a very good quote. This one of this. I actually learned that when I was doing game development. I think that might apply to pretty much anything that you do, but it's very common inside of this field. You have this paradigm, this slogan that says "fail faster." Like you want to learn, fail faster. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to make success. You want to learn. It's not about successes. It's about failures. That's how you learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's part of the human existence. It's how our existence interacts with the rest of the world. We don't just magically come up with ideas. We have to fail a bunch of times. One prominent example is Thomas Edison, the guy who created the light bulb?
Yeah.
And when he invented, I don't know, I kind of grew up, I think this is popular sentiment, but I kind of grew up thinking that, he was just kind of a genius and he just thought of this idea one day and he had all these other inventions. So he was a smart guy, a genius guy. But really, when you look up the history of how the light bulb was created, this dude, to use the filaments to find out what would burn with electricity going through it, to light up, to create light, he had to test out over 1,000 different materials before he actually found one to actually create the light bulb. So he failed 1,000 times before he actually invented the light bulb. So he just had the resources. He had some decent knowledge. He wasn't a terribly stupid guy, and he had the motivation to continue to go. And so it took 1,000 times before he even created the one thing that actually worked. I mean, that's just a general way of how our brains work. We don't just magically have ideas come out of our head. We have to, engage with the world. As Mao says, to know the pear, we have to bite the pear. We have to engage with something, and we have to fail. Look at babies trying to learn how to walk. We don't even know how to walk when we're born. So we have to fail at everything for us to learn how to do it correctly.
Right. So 2 messages from this. First one is maybe a bit discouraging, but we're gonna need to fail a lot and we're gonna need to keep failing for a while. But the encouraging message is that the fact that we keep failing does not mean that we are further away from our goal. The fact that we keep failing actually brings us closer to our goal. It's very important.
That's great. Perfect. I love it.
Important to keep that in mind. So let's continue and finish out the questions. So the next question is, well, as you have mentioned already, you subscribe to the ideology of Maoism. Maoism is treated with a lot of distrust in general. I feel like in Poland, Maoism is just completely misunderstood, and even like, for example, in the Western Europe, there were some dabbling, some flirting with Maoism in the 60s during the Cultural Revolution and so on. Well, I tell you a short anecdote. When I was once in an used bookstore in Poland, me and my friend, we found a magazine, some kind of a journal or whatever it was called, the Workers' Informant or something. It's difficult to describe, but it was like basically a monthly thing that was used to inform the proletariat, the workers, especially the industrial workers, of how, like, what's going on actually, what's going on economically, which direction is our economy actually developing towards, some international stuff, some ideological stuff. Well, a lot of that stuff was kind of nice. and I feel like a lot of people would appreciate to have something like this today. But I randomly opened on one of the pages, and I found there a piece about Maoism, and they just openly, like, they do not critically evaluate Maoism at all. It's straight up propagating the idea that Maoism is an anti-Soviet, anti-socialist, ultra-left ideology, which is very clear that at this point in time, Poland also was already deeply revisionist, bureaucratic, semi-capitalist state, and Maoism was a massive risk for the people who ruled Poland at the time. So they couldn't really allow Maoism to spread, whether they actually consciously understood that or whether they just unconsciously thought like, yeah, Maoism is just an ultra-left thing that we cannot allow to happen because we need to keep a stable economy and then stable growth and whatever, and we cannot have these upheavals here and whatever. It's what I'm getting to is basically in Poland, Maoism, it seems like it never was a thing. It never was even considered that it could possibly be something you could be interested in. It was completely discredited from day one, even more than it was in the West. And people are scared of this idea. They don't understand that. A lot of people will understand Maoism. Oh, it's just communism, but with peasants instead of workers, right? Some people will understand Maoism. Yeah, it's just about hunger, right? Or other people will not understand. A lot of people, when they think about cultural revolution, they don't even know about this thing, about this capitalist roader and socialist roader. They never heard those terms. They just think that cultural revolution was about destroying old churches and defiling the remains of important kings from the past or whatever. So my point is, what is Maoism in your words? How would you describe what Maoism is, and why Maoism? Why should people get interested in Maoism?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I won't be able to fully answer it, but I'll do what I can. I think to answer the question, what is Maoism? You have to answer the question first, what is Marxism? And I really want your audience to really try, just take a moment, try to answer that. What is Marxism? If someone asks you, what is Marxism? How would you describe it? And from my experience, a lot of people have trouble answering this question. I think there's a lot of people who know what Marxism is, but when you ask them this basic question, what is Marxism? You get different answers, different parts of answers, and it's not so great. It's not very digestible and understandable for most of the time. And I do want to make an episode, and actually the next episode on Politics in Command will be on this topic. So what is Marxism? I would argue it's a good place to describe Marxism. I think one of the easiest ways is that Marxism is made up of three components, three pillars, so to speak. One is philosophy. A second is political economy, and the third is scientific socialism. And so these are, it also describes how Marxism was formed historically. Marx studied England's political economy because it was the leading capitalist country of the world. He also studied philosophy in German, where he was from, coming from Hegel and whatnot, where philosophy was probably one of the most advanced. Their philosophy was just, I don't know, a bit more advanced and progressive than most philosophies in other parts of Europe, maybe even around the world, but Marx mainly stayed in Europe. And then he studied in France the socialist movements there, which were what he described as utopian socialist movements, and he put it on a scientific basis. So these three pillars together is what makes Marxism. And I remember in the past looking up on the internet and just typing in, what is Marxism? And sometimes I'll find an article and it will talk about how Marxism is a philosophy, and that philosophy is dialectical materialism, and that's what Marxism is. But then it never mentioned political economy or scientific socialism. Or I would have another article that would only talk about political economy and what Marx wrote about in Capital, and say that's what Marxism is, but they wouldn't talk about dialectical materialism or scientific socialism. But you can't just take one of these pillars and call it Marxism. It's all three of these pillars is what makes Marxism Marxism, and what makes it scientific, what makes it a philosophy, and what makes it an objective and scientific study of society, of the politics, the economy, the culture, so on and so forth. And then to go from Marxism to Leninism, I think, means that all three of these pillars must have been developed to a higher level, being represented in the name, Marxism, Leninism. Leninism meaning that Lenin and the Russian Revolution and the things that happened in Russia, but mainly someone who consolidated all of these ideas and put it into theory was Lenin, so therefore we called it Leninism, was that he did uplift all of these three pillars to a higher degree of understanding. And there may be some disagreement. There is actually a lot of disagreement. A lot of people who call themselves Marxist-Leninists, they say, well, Leninism is just Marxism in the stage or era of imperialism. You know, imperialism developed, so therefore we needed Marxism to be applied to this stage of capitalism called imperialism, and Lenin did that, so we call ourselves Marxist-Leninists. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. That means there needs to be kind of a different stage of Marxism at every level of society ever historically. And that doesn't make sense because Marxism could only be developed at a certain point in history when both the productive forces and the relations of production were at a certain level. I don't think, to put it another way, I don't think Marxism could have been established or created during the slave mode of production or during the feudal mode of production. It had to be the capitalist mode of production for Marxism to even be created and established. But without going down too far that path, I think Leninism brought those three pillars, economy, philosophy, and scientific socialism, to a higher level. And I think Maoism does the same thing as well. I think Mao developed philosophy and dialectical materialism to a higher level, which is very prominent in his writings of On Practice and On Contradiction, and even Contradictions Among the People, among various other writings. I think they took socialist construction in regards to the pillar of scientific socialism, further and farther than Russia did and the Soviet Union did. And the Cultural Revolution really exemplifies that. And I think their study of political economy also uplifted that pillar of Marxism to a higher stage. And so they were they were represented by actual successful revolutions that did have socialist construction to show that otherwise. There are obviously various other trends of Marxism, Hojism, Titoism. I don't know. There's just too many in the name. But there's no proof of any of these other tendencies to have uplifted and brought to a higher stage of understanding these three pillars of Marxism. And so that's the longer answer. But I think the shorter answer is basically Maoism explains to me more accurately and with further depth what is going on in the world and how to deal with these issues and these problems. For me, I would say actual Maoism, because with any tendency, there's also pseudo-Maoism, there's pseudo-Leninism, there's pseudo-communism, they're fake, they're revisionist, they're reformist, there's all kinds of things for them, but nonetheless, there's Maoists that are, there are pseudo-Maoists that call themselves Maoists, but they're not actually Maoists. And that's the same with any tendency. there are pseudo-Leninists that call themselves Leninists, and it's all confusing. No one's ever going to admit I'm a fake Maoist, because they truly believe genuinely inside that they are the true form of Maoist or Leninism or whatever it is. But generally speaking, I think Maoism just explains the world. It explains history much more deeply and more accurately than any other trend that I've come to see. And it actually provides a lot of answers that goes much further than, say, Leninism or just even orthodox Marxism. So that's the short answer that I have. I hope that makes sense, especially with the longer answer that I gave with the 3 pillars of Marxism and how every stage represents a higher understanding and development of those pillars.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. Thank you. I think, again, as you said, we could talk a long time about this and get into a lot of different details. But I'll just like to say that I had a similar experience with you saying that Maoism helps you actually understand what's going on around you. Well, for me, it was similar when I was first diving into Marxism. I read a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I had dabbled with Trotskyism, dabbled with like modern Chinese revisionism, and it was always the Maoist perspective that I just felt explains what's going on the best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I can relate to that experience. Also, one thing that I really think is important in Maoism is that it helps you understand how the class struggle continues under socialism, because this is where China and Soviet Union both failed, but China had a much stronger attempt at continuing the revolution, and by completely rejecting Maoism, then you don't understand the internal contradictions that led to re-establishment of capitalism, and you're always just blaming imperialist powers and just external factors, because you cannot find a really good reason why capitalism actually was reintroduced. It's beyond your comprehension if you completely disregard Maoism, basically, and disregards all its even if you disregard it on theoretical basis, you still need to learn about in practice what happened during the Cultural Revolution. It's crucial to understand this.
I agree 100%. I do want to add one more point, because you mentioned it, and this is a very popular idea that Maoism is just for peasants. And oh man, there's a lot to get into here, but I just want to kind of smash that idea and say that it's totally wrong. I mean, on the one hand, it is really good for peasants of the world historically. Like, it's a really good military strategy that Mao developed in China, as well as just a political strategy for revolution. Creating a democratic revolution that was kind of new. It was very new for his time, and Mao was able to prove that it was correct. So, I mean, yeah, it is very beneficial for peasants. But if people say that Maoism is just for peasants, then you're essentially saying that there is this bubble in this world, say peasants waging revolution, and that bubble is totally in isolation from the rest of the world, meaning that there's nothing universal, there's no universal aspects. So when people are saying that Maoism is only for peasants, they're essentially saying that this whole peasant world and this whole business about peasants and revolution is in complete isolation from the rest of the world. That there's no way, it's not connected. There's nothing there. There's nothing beneficial or advantageous for us to learn from that experience. Nothing whatsoever. That you can't say that about anything. Everything is interconnected in this world in some way. At the same time, there are very particular conditions under which that revolution was waged. There are particular conditions to Poland, to China, to Russia, to US that each country only has. But at the same time, and this is the great thing about dialectical materialism, is that there are also similarities. There are also universal aspects to every single one of these countries, and even different aspects of the world and universe that are all somewhat similar and different. So there's both particularities and universalities of everything that happens in this world. And having a mainly peasant revolution, but let's be real, the Chinese Revolution was led by the proletariat. The proletariat was small, the peasant base was large, but it was still a revolution led by a communist party that was made up and leading the working class movement there too as well. What are the universal aspects of that revolution that is applicable to other countries in the world that may have different components, say a larger working class, no peasants, like in the US? And that takes a lot of study and dedication to study that I think those people who just say Maoism is for peasants, they totally disregard the entire history and the particularities as well as the universalities of the Chinese Revolution and its history. So it's a very lazy answer is what I'm trying to say. To say that Maoism is just for peasants is a very lazy response to not understanding what actually happened in China, the significance of that history, and then applying what's universal there to the particular conditions here in the US or any other countries. It does take a lot to understand that, but it's worth it and it's necessary. And then, so the last thing is just like, it's a lazy response.
Yeah, it's a lazy anti-intellectual response. But I think one more thing that might be getting into play here is deep-rooted class and ethnic chauvinism, which is being like, okay, first of all, these are peasants. This is not the proletariat. So why would I care? Well, that's chauvinist. That's classist in a sense, right? Because you can learn from them, right? They have something to teach you. And second one is like, well, disregards the Chinese revolution because like, well, we live in a much more developed industrial countries than they were, so that they were on a much lower level of development. So why should we learn anything from them if their revolution is completely different than our revolution is gonna look like? And it's just chauvinist approach, really. That's what I think it is.
Yeah. It just real quick, it does, even though we don't have peasants here in the US, what China was trying to solve overall was the contradictions between the cities and the countryside. And even though the countryside there was filled with peasants and the cities were filled with more workers, proletariat, in the US, we still have a countryside, we still have a rural side, and we have a city side, but we just don't have peasants in the rural countryside. It's a bit different, but there are still contradictions there between the countryside and the cities that we need to answer here in the US. And some of those answers we could get by studying how China dealt with those differences, those contradictions in their own country, albeit different, but also very similar. So that's just kind of one more specific example that kind of look into some of these issues.
Right, makes sense. It's they tried to solve some problems, they made some progress on the questions that we still gonna need to face, but just in different conditions. But let's move to the last question and let's wrap it up, hopefully. This is a question that I added spontaneously later on after I send you the list of the questions, so I know you might not have anything in mind, so if nothing comes up in your mind to answer, that's fine, we can just skip it. But I was just thinking, you have quite a lot of years of experience in different kind of organizing, and just generally, what advice could you give to people new to organizing?
Oh yeah, that's always a good question. Whew. So I would say in most countries around the world, there is not a revolutionary situation currently happening. um, there are mass movements. There's all kinds of horrible things happening. But as far as like an actual revolutionary condition or even a revolutionary movement that's happening, there's not that many that's happening around the world. So I imagine most people who will listen to this, you're not in that situation. And if you're not, just be real with yourself. You're not like, I want you to study and be dedicated and discipline yourself and try to figure out what it actually means to be a principled communist in your country. But also take your time. You could still do it without sacrificing everything in your life, which I see people do. And what they do is they get burnt out very quickly. 1, 2, maybe 3 years, and they get sick of this stuff and they quit because they put everything into it. It's kind of an immature way to approach really anything in your life. So I would say take your time with it. You know, actually, in Poland, are you raised with the story of the tortoise and the hare? You know, the turtle and the rabbit racing?
Yeah, we know that one.
So who wins at the end?
Yeah, it's the tortoise.
The tortoise always wins, right? Slow and steady, as they say. Slow and steady. And I had a comrade actually make a shirt for me with a turtle on it that says slow and steady wins the race, because I would say this so much. And yeah, as someone who's older, I would say, yeah, take your time with it. Be serious about it. Taking your time with it and being serious, that's not mutually exclusive. It can happen at the same time. I think there's also one other point is you can't isolate yourself from society. I think a lot of people who get into Marxism or communism, something has really happened that's been really bad in their lives. And at least this is how it is in the US and America. For a lot of people who get into communism, is they really hate the world. They hate society. They hate the way that their lives have been shaped. And they're trying to find a way to validate their hatred of this world and this country. And just hatred of people around them in general is what it ultimately comes down to. And they'll find communism or Marxism or something like that, and they'll use it to validate their feelings of hatred. And then they try to become a Marxist or communist, but really in the end, they just kind of hate everything, and they're very pessimistic. And it's not sustainable, and it's not the right reason to study Marxism or to get into communism. And you won't ever really be a good principled Marxist or a principled communist with that type of view. Unfortunately, we're just at the level where communism is so low and so unpopular that it does attract people who have really bad experiences in life, not due to their fault, but then they use it to kind of just hate everything around them. So as much as we want to hate the world and what happens, there's also a part of it where we've got to love it. We've got to enjoy it. We've got to not isolate with it. We've got to engage with it, actually. How do we use these Marxist ideas and actually engage with the world? Because I think what happens is, this is the main point I'm trying to get to, is people get to Marxism and then they try to isolate themselves. And they try to say that they're pure Marxists, that they're perfect, that they don't have any more bad ideas. They don't have any more bourgeois ideas that are influencing them. That's not true. You're always going to be in this type of society that is influencing you. It's going to be a lifelong struggle to fight against these bourgeois ideas. It doesn't just go away overnight. And but really, you just got to use these Marxist ideas and being a principled Marxist as a way to engage with society, not to avoid it, to engage with it in a principled way. Those are my suggestions, I would say, to someone who's new to this stuff.
Right. I think that's very good suggestions. And let me link that to 3 quotes, actually, by famous Marxists. First one by Che Guevara, when he was asked about one of the most important characteristics of a true revolutionary, he answered, it's love. You need to do this stuff out of love. You cannot do this shit out of hatred. You need to do this shit because you love humanity and you love our planet and you love life and you love everything around you and you want the best course of action for it. You want to preserve the planet against climate change. You want to preserve people against exploitation and against oppression. You cannot do this stuff out of hatred because you're just gonna become bitter and you're just gonna become what you hate. You need to remember that you need to remember to do stuff out of love, basically. And second thing I wanted to say, I told about the tortoise and the hare. Well, as Lenin said, there is decades when nothing happens, and then there's weeks when decades happen. Well, fortunately or not, unfortunately or not, we are in the period where decades are happening. Not much is fundamentally changing. I think that might stay like this for a while. So don't expect a revolution tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, next year, or maybe even next decade. Hell, you have to prepare yourself for the fact that revolution might not come in your lifetime. And if revolution does not come, you still have to find a way to live a happy and fulfilling life. You cannot just put all your eggs into one basket and expect a magic revolution to happen and solve all your problems. That's not gonna happen. And third thing I want to say is there is a lot of reasons now to feel pessimistic. There is a lot of reasons now to feel hateful. And as Gramsci said, we need pessimism of the mind. It's rational to be pessimistic, but we need optimism of the heart because good stuff can happen. And if we don't surrender, then good stuff will happen.
Very good quotes. I love it. And you did that right off the fly. Great. That was great. I love it.
All right. That does it. That's the end of the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today. It lasted way longer than I thought. I think I'm just need to gonna assume every time I talk to Marxists, we just need like a 10-hour block booked for talking.
Yes, it always goes like this. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed listening to you. I learned a few things that I find valuable, and I hope other people will find listening to this as enjoyable as I have found it to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciated this conversation. It's always fun to dive into this and also hopefully reach out to your audience over there. And again, I'm Jay. I'm the host and founder of a podcast called Politics in Command. If you're interested and listen to English understand English fairly well, check it out. But other than that, yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was fun.
Thank you.